Hey listeners, welcome back to another episode of Let's Think Green. I'm Bria, the host of the podcast, and today we got a really special guest. She's the co-founder of the Instagram page Stress Elucidated, a high school senior, and an avid gardener. Please welcome Apurva.
Hey everyone, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you on the podcast. Today, we'll be thinking and talking about composting. And if you're not a gardener, this is still an episode that you want to listen to. Composting is really important and it's a great way to reuse, I guess you could say reuse. Yeah, reuse your food scraps. Apurva here is an expert composter. They have the whole setup in their backyard and they use it in their gardens and it's really professional. But you don't need to be an avid gardener to do composting. But before we get into any of that, let's first talk about what is composting, Apurva?
Yeah, so composting is basically where you take your food scraps from your meals or from any leftovers that you have that are biodegradable, and you basically just put them in this bin. If you don't have a bin, a cardboard box also works. And you basically sort of just let them cook in there in the heat, and you get some very nutritious soil at the end that's actually very, very good for your garden.
So you said bin. Are there specific composting bins that I can buy?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot online, and they range around $100. So if you're a beginner composter, maybe you might want to start out in something like a cardboard box because it'll work just as good. Except if you live somewhere where it rains, you might want to reconsider. A plastic bin would work just as well. But yeah, a composting bin if you want to go professional. But otherwise, start out in a plastic bin.
And should the bin be covered, airtight, or should there be holes in it to let the air go in?
Yeah, some aeration would definitely be desirable. I would also suggest putting a lid on it.
Okay.
All the rainwater can mess things up for sure. So yeah.
So I put all my scraps in the bin and then I just leave it in my garage or leave it outside. And how long do I have to leave it in a somewhat warm environment before I have my soil all ready?
So it depends on the temperature. For example, in the summer over here, compost cooks really, really quickly. So you can get your finished compost in 2 to 3 weeks because it's really fast. In the winter, however, it takes forever, so it can sit there for about a month or two. Also, if you're continuously putting in food scraps, it'll take a while for it to completely compost because you're continuously putting in more stuff. So depends on all of those things, but it's usually pretty quick if it's a warm environment.
Yeah, so for context, we live in Georgia where it can get in the 90s over the summer. And then in the winter, it's 40 degrees. Sometimes it goes to 30 or 20, especially in the night, but mostly it stays 40. So it's pretty mild in the winters too. So even if you're in a cold environment, you can totally compost. It'll just take a little longer.
Yeah, for sure. My aunt lives in Chicago. You know it goes below freezing there. Her compost is doing fine.
Oh, that's cool. Okay, so even in the winter?
Even in the winter.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did you personally get into composting?
Yeah, so my mom's always been very into composting and very into sustainability. And for the longest time, we couldn't do it because we were moving everywhere and, we didn't have the space to do it because we were living in small apartments. But now that we have a backyard and we have, the place to do it, my mom decided that it would be a great time to start.
Now, for a little more context, Apurva in her backyard, she has the composting bins that you can get, and it sits in her backyard. But even if you live in an apartment, you can totally do composting. You can use a small plastic container as opposed to the big bins, and just leave it in your kitchen counter, right? Or you can leave it could you leave it on your porch if it's a covered porch? Yeah. So even if you live in an apartment, it's totally doable. What size composting bin would you recommend?
So the one we have is basically 2 chambers, and it's not very, very big. It's about waist length, waist height, and it sits 2 feet above the ground. So it's not super huge, and it's definitely very convenient if you have a smaller space, like an apartment balcony or something, where you need it to do this composting.
Yeah, but any size would work.
Any size works, yeah.
Okay, now this is the most important question. What goes in your composting bin?
Yeah, so for us, what we put a lot is food scraps, right? So food scraps used while preparing food. And the most important thing when composting is making sure to balance that ratio between dry stuff and wet stuff. Wet stuff is all of the food scraps and, any other wet stuff you have, I guess. And dry things are things like leaves, twigs, dry grass that, you get when people mow their lawns and stuff. Balancing that ratio is very important because if the compost is too wet, it usually won't cook properly and you'll get a lot of bugs in it that are unwanted. Too dry, it's also going to have like cooking problems, and it's not going to be ideal. It's going to be too crumbly and stuff. So it's usually a good ratio is about, you know, half dry, half wet, somewhere around there. A little more dry works depending on the season. I would suggest a good way to get dry compost or like dry stuff for your compost is in the springs and the falls, like when people are mowing their grasses, like literally just go up to their driveway and get their bags, because they won't mind and it'll be really good.
Even if the grass has pesticides in it, would it still work?
That's a good question, and I think it should still work because, I mean, this stuff will be going into your garden and the plants will take whatever nutrients they want from the soil. So I think it should be okay.
Okay, yeah. And also in the fall, like when the leaves fall off the tree, you can use that. And if you are a gardener and you prune your plants, and whatever like twigs come off of that would work great as well. As you can see, composting is really easy and straightforward, and all of us have food scraps that we can throw away. Instead of putting those food scraps in a trash can that has a plastic bag lining, and then that plastic bag, you know, going to the landfill and everything, make a composting pile and put it in your garden. That'll be a great way to limit the number of plastic bags that are going into the landfill. Aside from that, what are other environmental benefits to doing composting?
The one you mentioned is definitely a huge one, because all of these food scraps are biodegradable, and that like the plastic bag just stops it from, you know, decomposing in the way it should. That's something we learned pretty quickly because we now have very little trash that goes out. So that's been really cool. It's very, very good for your garden. And even if you don't garden, this is an excellent nutritional thing to give to the plants out in your front yard, or the plants that other people have maybe in their gardens. And if you don't have like any place to give it to, like say you live in New York and it's just a concrete jungle around you, I am sure there are multiple community farms or community gardens that are willing to take this, because they're always looking for good organic nutrition for their plants.
So even if you don't garden, you can still totally compost. You can give it to the trees in your front yard. For me, we have a lot of forest in our backyard, so we could like put it there, and I mean that'd be good nutrition for the trees in our backyard. And then, as Apurva said, also see if there are any public gardens in your community. They will happily take your compost. We just talked about what composting is, how to do it, the process, and where you can use it. But now let's go into how you care for your composting. So, is there like any care even involved in composting?
I mean, there's a little bit, but definitely not too much. It's very, very low key, and you can definitely do it if you have, you know, time restrictions. So basically, the main thing you want to do is you want to keep feeding it every now and then, at least once a day, once every 2 days. As you make food, just make sure to put it in the compost. It's really gonna go and appreciate it. I would suggest when you put in the wet stuff, also put in the dry stuff, like
It's not
as
the
a
same
ratio.
time.
Yeah, as a ratio of like how much wet stuff you're putting. So let's say you put in a bucket full of wet stuff, you should put in another bucket full of dry stuff, just to keep that ratio balanced. And every now and then you should definitely also take a stick and mix it. My compost actually rolls, like it spins. So,
yeah, her bin has like a handle on the side which you can rotate, and then the whole thing rotates.
Yeah, and that's definitely really useful, because then I don't have to go in with the stick and mix it all. But if you're doing this in a plastic bin, you definitely want to make sure that you're mixing everything around so that everything is cooked evenly, and that if there are bugs in your compost, they can, you know, eat stuff on all the layers.
How do you know when your compost is ready to be put in a garden or near the trees, especially when you're constantly putting stuff in it?
Yeah, so I would suggest when you have enough in it that it's like getting full, just closing the bin and like letting it sit there, letting it rest for maybe 1 or 2 weeks before you open it again. And at this point, you're not adding anything else in it. You're just finishing it off and keeping it there. I would suggest, depending on the weather again, looking at it 1 or 2 weeks later, and it should look like really rich, moist, like black or dark brown, like loam soil. So like it should look like soil. You should
like really soft and like broken down.
You shouldn't be able to see what food scraps you put in there.
Oh wow.
Like it should just look like soil, not like the contents of.
Okay, that brings me to my next question. Once my compost is done, how do I put it in my garden or in my trees in the soil?
Yeah, so what I do and what we do in our garden beds is we basically just take it out of the bin and just mix in a little bit with the soil of the garden beds that we have already. So if we're just putting it on the top, we'll make sure to put it near the base of the plant, and then take a stick or a shovel or something and just mix it in with the soil that the plant is already in. So you want to make sure that the compost is getting to the roots where the plant's going to take all of those nutrients from.
Now that doesn't mean you gotta like dig down deep, like a foot or two, if the roots in your garden are really extensive, or if the trees have a really built-in root system, just enough so that the roots are that it's like close enough so the roots are able to get the nutrients from your compost. That wraps up this episode with Apurva Composting 101. You can DM us on Instagram at Let's Think Green Podcast if you have any more questions, and we'll be sure to get back to you. And let us know if you started a composting pile.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like this episode, be sure to check out another one that these guys have on planting native plants, because as we know, we all love to garden over here. Make sure to leave a great review on Apple Podcasts because these guys are doing such an amazing job.
Thanks,
and they deserve
Apurva.
love. Additionally, just like this video.
If you're listening on YouTube, clearly we know what's going on here.
For all of our YouTube listeners, please like, comment, and subscribe, and share this video if you loved it. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks Apurva so much for joining us. And if you want to follow Stress Elucidated, that's their Instagram at Stress Elucidated.
ELUCIDATED.
See you all next time. Let's think green.